Welcome to the Neurokrish Immersion. This is From Moments to Movements, a brain, mind, and public square masterclass. And this is the Detached Observer version of the Neurokrish Immersion, where we look at events in public life and politics and put them under the brain and mind lens. Over the last few months, I found myself returning again and again to the same observation. Public life is often remembered through moments, but societies are shaped by movements, and movements endure only when moments are patiently cultivated. Only afterwards did I realize that I had been approaching the same question from three different directions without intending to. Each episode began as independent curiosity, yet, somewhere in the writing, they quietly assembled themselves into a single inquiry. How does a society decide, moment by moment, whom to trust? How does that trust persuade power to respond? And what becomes of that trust once the immediate victory has passed? In the first episode of Moral Authority and Collective Minds, I explored the beginning of that journey. How does a moment of conscience become a movement? Why does one hunger strike move a nation while another, equally sincere, does not? And this episode was published as an editorial, an op-ed in the Times of India, maybe about 10 days ago. Why does the collective mind decide that one individual comes to embody a cause while another remains, however deserving, at its margins? And we were talking, of course, about Anna Hazare and Sonam Wangchuk in that episode. That episode was about beginnings, about sequence, about narrative, and about the direction in which trust was first seen to flow. In the second episode, When Power Yields, I crossed to the other side of the barricade. What does durable power do when confronted by sustained moral pressure? History suggests that resilient institutions rarely survive by refusing to bend. Rather, they survive by discerning where they can bend without surrendering what they regard as their essential core. The image that stayed with me was the bamboo. Not the rigid tree that snaps in the storm, the bamboo which yields without abandoning its roots. A third episode asked a question that is seldom asked after public victories. After the yield begins, where most commentary ends, when the cameras have departed, when the speeches have concluded, and when the celebration has subsided, what becomes of the movement itself? Can the energy that inspired a crowd be cultivated into something that outlasts the crowd? Can inspiration become institution? Can followers become custodians? Can a battlefield become a dojo? And today, that was an editorial again in the op-ed page of the Times of India, 11th of August. Running beneath all three episodes is the same architecture of human behavior. Public life is not shaped by argument alone. It emerges from millions of individual brains continually predicting, interpreting, and deciding whom to trust, when to follow, when to resist, when to yield, and perhaps most importantly, what deserves to be cultivated once the storm has passed. These three episodes are therefore not really about politics. Politics merely provided the laboratory. They are about the human mind in public life. I have called this masterclass From Moments to Movements, Brain, Mind, and the Public Square, because that is ultimately the journey that we shall take together. From the spark to the crowd to power to the quieter work that begins after the applause has faded. I recommend experiencing these conversations in the order that they emerged: of moral authority and collective minds, when power yields, after the yield, why inspired brains must become cultivated minds. Because together they are not simply three podcasts, they are one inquiry. Let us begin. Of moral authority and collective minds. And I'm talking about Hazare, Wangchuk, and the ongoing protest in Delhi. Let me ask you something before we begin. Have you ever wondered why one act of sacrifice moves an entire nation, while another, just as sincere, just as courageous, barely moves the needle? I have. It began with two photographs, and if you're interested in this, please read the Times of India article that came out yesterday, the 20th of July, the op ed which I authored on the same subject. In one, an old man lies on a hospital pillow, eyes closed, exhausted. The year is 2011. In the other, a different man lies in almost the same posture, on almost the same kind of pillow, eyes closed, exhausted. The year is 2026. 15 years apart, two hunger strikes, two men who gave their bodies to cause larger than themselves. If you didn't know the dates, you could almost mistake one photograph for the other. The same closed eyes, the same white sheet pulled up to the chest, the same quiet exhaustion that no camera angle can soften. And yet, one of those two images became something close to a national heirloom, reproduced, printed, remembered. The other, though it moved plenty of people, never quite crossed the same invisible line into the nation's shared memory. Well, at least it hasn't to date. Anna Hazare's fast in 2011 seemed to gather the whole moral weight of the country around it. Millions who could not have explained the Lokpal bill nevertheless felt somehow that this old man's hunger was their own. Sonam Wangchuk's fast this year was no less sincere. He gave up food for the same reasons Anna Hazare once did, to make a nation look at something it was choosing not to see. He was widely respected, he was written about, he was worried over, and yet it never quite occupied the same place in the public mind. Political scientists will tell you why, and they will not be wrong. Different decade, different media, different public mood. And of course, the public mood is changing, and today, on the 21st of July, we don't really know what the public mood will be tomorrow. So, all those explanations are true. They are just not, I think, the whole story. Somewhere underneath the politics, I began to suspect something quieter was happening. Something that had less to do with either man and more to do with the rest of us, with how millions of ordinary minds watching the same event quietly decide who to trust. I am a behavioral neurologist, and most of my working life has been spent with individual brains, not with nations. Patients arrive with memory loss, with epilepsy, with anxiety that has no name yet. Their stories unfold, one person at a time. The consulting room is, if anything, the least political place I know. But the longer you sit with individual minds, the more you start noticing the same pattern wherever you look. Trust, for instance. It sounds like such a simple word, and yet almost everything in medicine depends on it. My patients rarely have the expertise to judge my diagnosis, so they ask themselves something else instead, usually ever without putting it into words. Can I trust this person? And here is the strange part. That judgment doesn't wait for facts. It begins within the first few minutes of meeting someone. Tentative, incomplete, often wrong, and then it simply refuses to leave. I began to wonder why. We've all felt this, I suspect, outside a clinic too. We meet someone for the first time, and within minutes we've decided thoughtful or impatient or generous or guarded. Months later, after conversations that really ought to have complicated that first guess, something in us keeps quietly filing new evidence under the same old heading. Patients occasionally tell me why they sought a second opinion and then came back to me anyway. It's rarely because the second doctor knew less. It's something harder to name. I felt I knew where he was coming from, one told me once. She seemed consistent, said another. Neither sentence is really about expertise. Both are something closer to coherence. A doctor who has become, in a patient's mind, a stable, predictable model of a person. And the answer, it turns out, is not really about psychology at all. It's about how the brain itself is built. For most of the last century, we thought of the brain as a kind of camera. The world arrived through the senses, and the brain simply recorded it. Reality first, understanding after. We don't think that anymore. The brain we understand today is not a camera. It is an anticipator. Long before you're consciously aware of anything, it is already asking questions. What is this? Have I seen it before? What happens next? In other words, the brain spends its whole life predicting the world and then quietly checking those predictions against what actually arrives. Walk into your own home after many years away. You don't inspect the sofa to make sure it's still there. Your brain has already predicted it. You only really notice. You really wake up when something is missing. A painting gone from the wall. A chair in the wrong place. When prediction fails, attention arrives, and that's the whole trick. And it's a remarkably efficient one because the alternative, rebuilding the entire world from scratch every waking second, would be unlivable. Psychologists have a name for a related idea, the primacy effect. The first piece of a story becomes the scaffolding the rest of the story has to fit into. A first diagnosis colors every test that follows it. A first chapter shapes how you read the ending. Our first stories are stubborn, not because we are irrational, because revising them is expensive for our brains. Uncertainty, I've come to believe, is the quiet adversary every nervous system is built to fight. And the brain reduces it however it can, through memory, through habit, through relationships it has learned to rely on, and very often simply through whichever story arrived first and made sense of things well enough to stop the searching. Genuine revision does happen. We meet people who append everything we thought we knew about them. Patients recover from illnesses we once have called untreatable. But real revision costs something. It asks the brain to take apart a model that has been working reasonably well and build a better one from that wreckage. Most of the time, we simply don't. Most of the time, our first story wins by default. Now, here is the question that changed the direction of this whole inquiry for me. If one predicting brain behaves this way, what happens when millions of them are predicting the same public event all at once? Perhaps a society doesn't think because it has a brain of its own. Perhaps it only appears to think because millions of individuals predicting brains are all trying to reduce the same uncertainty together. A single neuron knows nothing of consciousness. It just passes a signal along. And yet, 86 billion of them, wired together, somehow produce memory, language, and the sense of being someone. Watch a murmuration of starlings at dusk sometime if you ever get the chance. Thousands of birds moving as if one mind were directing all of them. There is no leader. No bird can see the whole shape. Each one is simply responding to its nearest neighbor. And out of that, a pattern emerges that looks almost choreographed. Nature seems to love this trick. The whole becomes something the parts alone can never be. Society, I began to think, are no different. No single newspaper owns public opinion. No single leader commands it. And yet, something does come into being. through millions of ordinary conversations in living rooms and offices and WhatsApp groups that none of us designed and all of us somehow share. We give it names: public mood, the national conscience, collective memory. Perhaps these are just different words for the same emergent thing. And it isn't only nations that do this, families do it too. Ask three people from the same family to describe one significant evening, and the details will differ in ways that surprise you. One remembers words that others have completely forgotten. Another remembers only the feeling in the room. And yet, underneath all that disagreement, there is usually a shared understanding nobody ever wrote down. Who is dependable? Who goes quiet during conflict? Who carries the worry for everyone else? No one taught anybody this. It just simply emerged. Walk into any old hospital, any old university, any long running business, and you will hear the same kind of sentence. That's just how things are done here. She represents everything this place stands for. He changed this institution completely. Buildings have no personality. Organizations have no nervous system. And yet, everyone inside them behaves as if the place itself has a character. Because, in a sense, it does. What they are really describing, I think, is a collective narrative that emerged the same way a starling's murmuration emerges. Nobody designed it. Everybody is quietly maintaining it. Here is where it gets for me genuinely strange. An individual brain cannot hold the full complexity of the world, so it compresses. It keeps what matters and lets the rest go, not because detail is worthless, but because a mind that tried to carry everything would carry nothing at all. I began to wonder whether societies do the same thing with history. No civilization can carry the full weight of its own past, so it doesn't try. It organizes that past around a handful of recognizable lives. Say the word Gandhi, and an entire moral landscape opens in your mind, instantly without effort. Say Mandela, and another one opens. Not because either man alone made history, but because history seems to compress its own overwhelming complexity into stories a human mind can actually hold and pass on. Children don't remember moral philosophy, they remember people. The Buddha, Joan of Arc, Gandhi. A single life becomes a vessel through which 1,000 ideas travel inside. And that thought carried me back, almost against my will, to the two men on the two pillows I began with, because I'd been asking the wrong question. It was never really only about public support or political strategy. What I was actually circling was something almost invisible: the relationship between a person and the movement that grows up around them. We are strangely sensitive to this. A great teacher doesn't just hand you information. Students quietly start organizing their thinking around the way the teacher sees the world and go on thinking that way for years after the lectures are forgotten. In medicine, a senior clinician can leave a hospital, and junior doctors will still catch themselves asking, years later, how would she or he have approached this? The person is gone, the pattern of thought remains. Influence, once it settles on you, has a way of outliving the person who gave it to you. And perhaps collective minds remember in exactly the same way. The direction of association becomes the direction of legitimacy. And that is my central thesis. Say that slowly, because I think it matters. The direction of association gradually becomes the direction of legitimacy. Anna Hazare, in the public imagination, came first, a solitary man of conscience, and only afterwards did a movement gather itself around him. Whatever happened politically later, the first impression never left. Conscience came first, organization followed. The public had one clean, singular life to compress its trust around, and it did so almost instantly. You will remember the whole India against corruption story and how they gathered around Anna Hazare and how that movement captured our imagination as a nation in 2011. Sonam Wangchuk's story unfolded differently. He was already known, already respected for years of work on behalf of Ladakh statehood. But this particular fast wasn't about that. Weeks earlier, India's Chief Justice had made an offhand remark comparing the country's unemployed young people to cockroaches, or so it seemed the way he said it. He did say, of course, that he was misquoted. Almost overnight, a young political strategist turned that insult into a movement, the Cockroach Janta Party. Half satire, half genuine grievance, and within days it had gathered more followers online than either of India's largest political parties. It moved from the internet onto the street, camped itself at Jantar Mantar in New Delhi, and began demanding accountability for a string of examination leaks that cost students their futures and, in some tragic cases, their lives. That is the movement Wangchuk stepped into, not one he began, one that was already breathing. And many people watching saw a respected man walking into a cause that already had its own face, its own grievance, its own momentum. Not a movement gathering around a man joining a movement. I don't think that distinction is small. I think it's almost everything. Because a collective mind trying to compress a movement into one coherent, trustworthy story finds that task easy when there's only one life to compress it around. When a respected person instead joins something that already exists, the mind is being asked to do two things at once: a person and a cause, each with their own shape. And a divided story is always a weaker story than a singular one, however admirable both halves might be. This is not a judgment of either man's character. Both, by any fair measure, are men of real conviction. It is a description of how much work a collective mind has to do before it can settle into trusting a single, stable story, and how differently that work goes depending on who arrived first, the person or the cause. Of course, conviction alone never explains everything. We've all known a teacher, a doctor, an elder whose integrity was beyond question, and whose influence never left the room they were standing in. Something more than sincerity has to happen before private conscience becomes a public movement. And the strategist, Prashant Kishore, has a framework for this: the messenger, the message, the mechanics, and the missionaries. Let me repeat that: the messenger, the message, the mechanics, and the missionaries. The four M's that a movement needs to travel. A trusted messenger, a message people instantly understand, a means for it to spread, and ordinary people willing to carry it forward. Hazare's movement in 2011 lined all four up almost perfectly. An unclaimed messenger, and I remember the time when I first heard his name and came to know that he was a Gandhian working in rural India, and he had accomplished much even before he came on the stage. There was one clear, singular message: we need a Lokpal. Round the clock television, and missionaries who reached far past the usual activists into the middle class, into students, into people who had never protested anything before. And you will all remember friends and family who got very, very involved in this movement. You yourself might have got very, very involved in this movement too. Wangchuk's movement this year was built differently, not necessarily worse. The messenger already carried another identity. The message combined two causes rather than one. The reach was almost entirely digital in a media world now far more fragmented than it was in 2011. And the youth movement itself built an extraordinary following within days, at moments outpacing the country's largest political parties. The mechanics worked, the missionaries showed up. Think about how different those two media worlds actually were. In 2011, three or four television channels could put an image in front of the entire country all at the same hour, all telling roughly the same story. By this year, that shared hour barely exists anymore. 100 different algorithms are quietly deciding 100 million different versions of what's happening today, each one slightly different from the next. It's a much harder world in which to build one single shared story around one single life, no matter how sincere that life is. And yet the youth movement did it anyway, in its own register, astonishingly fast, which tells me the four M's were never really the missing piece here. What may have been missing is the one thing Kishore's four M's don't name: sequence. Whether the messenger summoned the movement or the movement summoned the messenger, this may be the missing variable. I want to test this idea against two lives it should, by rights, break, because both men on paper did exactly what Wangchuk did. They joined causes that already existed. Mahatma Gandhi came back to India in 1915 and joined the Indian National Congress, an organization decades old with its own leadership, its own factions, its own history. If sequence alone decided legitimacy, his authority should have been just as divided as the hypothesis predicts. It wasn't. Because Gandhi had already spent 2 decades building an unusually singular, coherent moral life in South Africa through satyagraha, in full view of Indians who were watching from home long before he ever returned. When he joined the Congress, the public didn't see politics recruiting a moral figure. It saw an already whole moral life walking into a vacant space, and then, within a few years, visibly bending the entire organization's direction to match his own. Champaran, non-cooperation, the Salt March. Each one the public watched the influence flow outward from Gandhi, not the reverse, even though technically he had joined them. Sequence, it turns out, isn't locked in forever at the moment you first arrive. It can be rewritten, but only through sustained visible action. Action a collective mind can actually watch happen in real time. I think something else is happening here too, alongside sequence. When we remember someone we've loved, we don't retrieve 1,000 separate memories. Our minds gather a whole lifetime into something far smaller: a smile, a phrase they've always used, a particular way of meeting bad news. We don't lose the complexity, we just learn to carry it differently. And perhaps societies do the same thing with a life like Gandhi's. He stops being Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, a man born on a particular day, and becomes something closer to a compressed moral landscape, a shape our minds can hold in a single breath and pass on to a child who has never read a word of history. Mandela is the sharper case still. He didn't found the African National Congress. He joined it in 1944, one recruit among many, inside a machine that had already been running for decades. For years, he was one leader among several, not a solitary conscience the movement gathered round. And yet, by the time he walked out of Victor Verster prison, the world already knew somehow who he was. not factually, morally. Most people couldn't have told you the details of a single speech or a single negotiation. The information, honestly, was thin. And still, a coherent story had already formed, waiting for him before he'd said a word. Where does that kind of certainty come from, if not information? I think it comes from something quieter. Trust, seen this way, isn't really an emotion, it's a prediction. When we say we trust someone, what we usually mean is, I believe I can guess how you'll behave when things get difficult, based on what you've already shown me. What rewrote the sequence for Mandela, I think, was 27 years, endured without compromises, an easier freedom would have demanded, followed by a release in which his own conduct, his choice of reconciliation over revenge, visibly authored South Africa's transition rather than simply accepting a script someone else had written. The collective mind went back and rebuilt the story in light of everything that came after. I don't think that's a flaw in the idea. I think it might be the most important part of it. The direction of moral authority isn't decided once, forever, at the first handshake. It gets rewritten, the same way an individual brain rewrites a memory every time it recalls it, compressed anew each time fresh evidence of character arrives. None of this, I want to be honest, is only about protest. Moral authority isn't only exercised on stage or in the history books. It moves quietly through very ordinary rooms. A physician asks a patient to trust a treatment they don't fully understand. And that trust was mostly built long before this particular conversation, out of consistency, out of whether care seemed to come first or convenience did. A teacher asks a student to think for themselves rather than simply comply. And that kind of authority can never be issued by a title. It has to be perceived as having come from somewhere real. A leader asks an organization to accept change handed down from above. And people resist, often not because the change is wrong, but because authority that only ever arrived through position, without being first earned through visible integrity, rarely earns real commitment. And a parent asks a child to tell the truth. A child who is only ever instructed complies out of fear. A child who has watched a parent's honesty arrive before every lecture about honesty carries something closer to conviction. In every one of these rooms, power can be handed over. Authority can be delegated on a letterhead. Moral authority has to be earned, and it seems to have been earned in a particular direction, with conscience arriving first and everything else following behind it. Let me repeat that. Moral authority has to be earned in a particular direction, with conscience arriving first and everything else following behind it. The consulting room, the family, the institution, the nation, each one in its own way is really asking the same old question. Who can we reasonably expect to remain themselves when things get difficult? It's a biological question long before it's a philosophical one. Our brains have been asking some version of it since long before there were nations to trust or movements to join, since small bands of people had to decide quickly whom to follow into uncertainty. Only the scale has changed, the question hasn't. None of this settles whether either Hazare or Wangchuk was right. Whether you agree with either man is honestly beside the point of everything I've tried to say tonight. What I keep circling back to is a simpler, stranger question. How does a society decide who to trust? How does legitimacy actually form, moment by moment, inside millions of minds that will never meet each other, never compare notes, and yet somehow arrive at something that feels, from the outside, like a single shared verdict? The different parts of Hazare's movement in 2011 and Wangchuk's this year point to something larger than either man. Collective minds don't only weigh arguments, they weigh relationships. They ask who stood first and who followed, and where the legitimacy in the room seemed to begin. And then, sometimes, given enough time, given enough truth, they go back and ask it all again. Sometimes that almost invisible direction decides whether a protest becomes a movement. And sometimes, if the life behind it is coherent enough, sustained enough, that direction can still be rewritten. Which brings me back to where I started. Two men, two pillows, 15 years apart. Who moved first? It's a smaller question than it sounds, and I think it might be one of the oldest questions we have. Older than politics, older than protest, present every time one human being decides whether to place their trust in another. We take part in answering it every single day in small ways we barely notice. Every conversation we have, every story we choose to repeat, every person we quietly decide, without quite deciding, to trust. Understanding the brain, in the end, was never really only about neurons. It's always about understanding ourselves. And perhaps understanding ourselves is only the very first step towards understanding each other. I think often these days about how much of public life now turns on exactly this, on sequence, on who is seen to move first, on which story a million scrolling thumbs decide to compress a person into, long before anyone has met them, long before anyone has heard them speak in full. It happens faster than it used to. It is, I suspect, no less human for the speed. We cannot always choose the order in which the world comes to know us. Wangchuk didn't choose to arrive second into a movement he clearly, deeply believed in. But perhaps what both these lives, his and Gandhi's and Mandela's, quietly teach us is that the story doesn't end in the first frame. It only begins there. What comes after, if it is sustained long enough and honest enough, still has the power to rewrite where legitimacy is seen to begin. That perhaps is the small hope hiding inside a rather cold piece of neuroscience. Take care of your brain, your body, and your mind, and take care too of the direction in which you place your trust. There's an old observation, almost a proverb in several cultures. The bamboo bends in the storm, the rigid tree snaps. We usually hear it as advice about personal resilience. Today, I want to hold it against something larger, the behavior of political power when it's pressed hard by the street, by organized discontent, or by the moral force of the moment. What happens when power yields? Does the yielding mark defeat? Does it mark cunning? Or does it reveal a different quality altogether? The capacity to absorb pressure, protect what is essential, and continue. In late July 2026, Union Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan resigned. A student movement that had taken the name Cockroach Janata Party declared victory. Sweets were distributed at Jantar Mantar. The language of historic breakthrough filled the air. Within hours, another minister held additional charge. The agitation was called off and the ordinary work of government resumed. It looked on the day like a clear loss of face. Yet, those who have watched Indian politics over a longer arc will recognize a pattern. This was not the first time the present central government had appeared to give ground under sustained pressure. It was the third significant instance in roughly 6 years. Each time, the same quiet question returns. After the concession, what remains? Tonight, we stay with that question. We will move slowly. We will look at the movements that forced the yields, at the young figures who rose against the same formation, at the most successful of those disruptors, and the deeper structures, organizational and psychological, that decide whether a political force bends and recovers or bends and frays. This is not a verdict. It's an attempt to understand the method. Let us begin with the most recent moment. The Cockroach Janata Party did not grow from a traditional political machine. It began in online irony, gathered force around repeated failures of the examination system, most visibly the NEET paper leaks, and found its focal demand in the resignation of the education minister. Sonam Wangchuk's hunger strike, the police response at the march towards parliament, the involvement of opposition voices, and the persistence of the sit-in at Jantar Mantha turned a grievance about institutional incompetence into a national spectacle. When the minister resigned, the immediate demands were largely met. Compensation for families of students who had died by suicide linked to the crisis, withdrawal of cases against peaceful protesters, and the symbolic removal of the minister himself. The movement claimed a victory of patience and pressure. The physical agitation wound down. From the government side, the response was rapid and contained in the end. Additional charge of the ministry was assigned, assurances were recorded, the street presence that had sustained the pressure was removed. The first observation is simple. The concession closed the most visible grievance quickly. A prolonged confrontation would have allowed the mobilization to deepen, attract wider alliances, and perhaps harden into something more lasting. By meeting the proximate demands, power ended the phase of open contest while retaining control of the larger institutional and narrative ground. Whether this becomes a lasting shift or another absorbed episode depends on what follows, on whether the examination system is substantively repaired, and on whether the energy of the movement is turned into an organization that outlives the single grievance. History suggests that the second task is harder than the first. To see why, we need to look at the earlier yields. In December 2019, the Citizenship Amendment Act was passed. It offered a faster path to citizenship for non-Muslim refugees from three neighboring countries. Protests rose almost at once in the Northeast, on university campuses, in Shaheen Bagh, and other sites across the country. The movement framed the law as a threat to the secular character of the Constitution and, when linked in public argument to a possible national register of citizens, as a danger to larger numbers of Muslim citizens who might struggle with documentation. The government did not repeal the act. It delayed the framing of rules. Administrative measures, prohibitory orders, selective arrests, and a political framing of the protests as anti-national or externally influenced were deployed. Violence occurred in places. Then, the COVID-19 lockdown arrived and dispersed the physical sit-ins. For more than 4 years, the law remained on the statute book without operational rules. In March 2024, the rules were notified. Implementation began. The legislative core had survived. What happened in the aftermath is instructive. The opposition and civil society could claim a moral victory in the scale and persistence of the protests. Yet, the movement remained, in its most visible expressions, largely urban and struggled to convert street energy into a durable all India organizational structure. Once the physical presence ended, the issue receded from daily political salience. When the rules finally appeared, resistance was real but contained. The 2024 general election returned the BJP-led alliance to power. The episode was absorbed into a larger story of waiting out opponents while preserving the essential claim. Power had yielded on timing. It had not yielded on the core. Time, institutional continuity, and the difficulty of sustaining protest without continuous organizational work had worked in its favor. The second episode was more unambiguous. In September 2020, three agricultural laws were passed with the stated aim of liberalizing markets for farm produce. Large numbers of farmers, particularly from Punjab, Haryana, and western Uttar Pradesh, saw them as a threat to the minimum support price system and to their livelihoods. They marched to the borders of Delhi and stayed. The sit in lasted nearly a year. It was disciplined, well organized, and carried real electoral weight in the states that mattered. In November 2021, the Prime Minister announced that the laws would be repealed. He offered a public apology for the government's failure to convince the farmers. The formal repeal followed in Parliament. This was a genuine climb down. A signature reform package was abandoned. Yet, the political aftermath did not match the scale of the concession. The unity of the farm unions proved temporary once the single point demand was met. Regional parties tried to own the victory. National opposition parties struggled to turn it into a lasting agrarian platform against the ruling formation. In the 2022 Uttar Pradesh elections, the BJP retained power. The farmers' issue did not produce the electoral earthquake some had anticipated. The government shifted register from reformist urgency to reassurance and moved the conversation elsewhere. Again, a pattern. A high cost position was sacrificed when the political price became too high. The core electoral and organizational machinery was protected. The opposition's difficulty in institutionalizing the moment of victory allowed a return to ordinary politics. In the CAA episode, in the farm laws episode, and now in the early aftermath of the 2026 student protests, a sequence is visible. Power absorbs the immediate cost. It uses time. It relies on administrative continuity. It reframes the concession as responsiveness rather than weakness. And it benefits from a recurring difficulty on the other side. Moral victories do not automatically become organizational permanence. CADA activity does not stop because a particular demand was accepted. The larger ideological frame remains available to interpret the concession as prudence. Narrative infrastructure continues to function. The protest cycle is waited out. There is a neuropsychological undertow here too. Ambiguity unsettles the brain. The amygdala reads an unresolved crisis as a low-grade threat, and the mind reaches for anything that resembles resolution. A quick concession, a minister replaced, a headline of closure. These do not need to solve the underlying problem. They only need to feel like an ending. This is why the simple binary of they lost, we won is insufficient as analysis. A government that never yields can become brittle. A government that yields without coherence becomes hollow. The narrower path is selective flexibility backed by organizational depth. Nelson Mandela once observed that a leader is like a shepherd who stays behind the flock, letting the most nimble go on ahead, whereupon the others follow, not realizing that all along they were being directed from behind. The remark is about leadership style, yet it also speaks to the long game. Power that can wait, that can allow a visible retreat while continuing to shape the larger movement of events, often outlasts power that must always appear unbending. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of the arc of the moral universe bending towards justice, a long arc. Gandhi's politics, too, was built on the understanding that time and moral persistence could wear down rigid structures. The point is not that the present Indian government operates by those moral frameworks. The point is that the long game itself, the capacity to think in sequences longer than a single confrontation, is a quality of durable power, whether the ends are just or contested. The bamboo bends, the rigid tree snaps, The question is which kind of structure one is dealing with. While these larger confrontations were unfolding, a series of younger figures rose by opposing the same political force. Their trajectories illuminate the organizational question from another direction. Kanhaiya Kumar became a national face after the 2016 JNU sedition case. Eloquent and symbolically powerful for a section of student and left politics, he contested the 2019 Lok Sabha election on a CPI ticket and lost. He later joined the Congress, was given responsibility for the student wing, and contested again in 2024 from Northeast Delhi, again losing. He remains visible, still critical of the government, but operates inside a larger, older party structure rather than as an independent mobilizer. Hardik Patel led the 2015 Patidar reservation agitation in Gujarat that briefly shook the BJP stronghold. He joined the Congress, was made a state-level office bearer, then publicly criticized the party, resigned, and joined the BJP in 2022. He is now a BJP legislator. The arc is clear: agitation leader, opposition vehicle, absorption into the ruling party. The original anti-BJP mobilization energy was neutralized through co-option. Alpesh Thakur followed a parallel path, an OBC community organizer who positioned himself against perceived neglect under BJP rule in Gujarat. He joined the Congress before the 2017 elections, won a seat and grew dissatisfied, and by 2019 had crossed to the BJP. Another instance of disruptive energy converted into political capital claimed by the ruling side. Jignesh Mevani, who rose after the 2016 Una flogging incident, took a different route. He won as an independent with Congress support, later formalized his association with the Congress, and has remained a vocal critic and sitting MLA. He has not been absorbed by the BJP. His limitation is scale, a state-level figure with national symbolic value but without a mass organizational machine capable of sustained challenge beyond Gujarat. Chandrasekhar Azad of the Beam Army represents a rarer outcome. He built an Ambedkarite organization focused on education and resistance to caste authorities, faced prolonged detention under the Uttar Pradesh government, launched the Azad Samaj Party, and in 2024 won the Nagina Lok Sabha seat. He continues as an independent Dalit voice critical of the BJP. This is closer to autonomous organizational persistence, an agitation leader who constructed parallel structures and converted them into a parliamentary foothold without being absorbed. Sheila Rashid, another face of the 2016 JNU movement, moved from high visibility dissent into a brief formal political experiment, then withdrew into academic work. By the mid-2020s, her public posture had shifted towards appreciation of certain aspects of the government's handling of Kashmir. Taken together, these cases show four broad outcomes: full co-option into the ruling party, incorporation into the traditional opposition but with reduced disruptive autonomy, the rarer construction of autonomous organization, and withdrawal or softening. Most youthful opposition that begins in confrontation and lacks either a durable social base or the capacity to build lasting structures ends in one of the first, second, or fourth paths. Among all those who rose against the established order in this period, Arvind Kejriwal and the Aam Aadmi Party achieved the most substantial electoral success. That success makes their internal history especially instructive. The party emerged from the India Against Corruption movement of 2011. It carried moral authority, a critique of the political class, and a promise of alternative politics. It defeated both the Congress and the BJP in Delhi more than once. It formed the government in Punjab. For a time, it had appeared to have solved the conversion problem that defeated most protest movements. And yet, the original cohort largely dispersed. Yogendra Yadav and Prashant Bhushan were expelled in 2015 after the Delhi victory, accused of indiscipline. Kumar Vishwas was progressively marginalized. Other founding or early voices left. By 2026, another major rupture occurred when a group of Rajya Sabha MPs, including figures once considered close to the leadership, exited. The party that began as a collective critique of the political class had become, in organizational terms, heavily centered on one individual. Electoral resilience coexisted with this attrition. AAP developed the capacity to win and govern. It did not simultaneously build an autonomous, daily active cadre system within its own ideological and organizational reproduction independent of the central figure. The skills and temperaments that generate mass mobilization are rarely the same as those required for sustained institutional management. Those who joined for the purity of the cause frequently found the subsequent pragmatism difficult. Those who prioritized winning found the idealists obstructive. Centralization around the successful leader followed. Limited spoils and rising personal ambitions intensified the tensions. External pressure raised the cost of internal dissent. The result is a recognizable sequence for new anti establishment formations: moral mobilization, electoral breakthrough, centralization around the successful leader, progressive departure of the original idealists and co founders, survival or decline as a more conventional political machine. AAP traveled further along this path than most. The pattern itself is older than any single individual. If new movements tend to fragment around personalities, what allows older formations to maintain commitment across time and leadership changes? The classical communist parties, at their strongest, built disciplined hierarchical machines with clear ideology, cell structures, continuous political education, and membership that required ongoing work. Cadres were expected to implement the line, recruit, and maintain presence in workplaces and neighborhoods. The Chinese party refined this into a formal system of selection, training, rotation, and evaluation that treated personnel as a strategic resource. Longevity came from institutionalized ideology plus organizational penetration plus adaptive capacity, not from perpetual charisma. The Indian National Congress was never a classical cadre party in the same sense. Its historical strength lay in a broad umbrella of character, the freedom movement legacy, and the networks of local notables. Over time, it became more dependent on family brand, media presence, and patronage. It retains residual depth in certain states and a capacity to absorb shocks, but it no longer possesses the disciplined, daily active, volunteer base of stronger cadre systems. Its endurance is more a function of historical legitimacy and the federal structure than of robust cadre reproduction. The BJP's distinct advantage lies in the Sangh Parivar, particularly the RSS. Through thousands of shakas, regular local gatherings focused on physical training, ideological discussion, and discipline, it produces a continuous supply of workers socialized into a worldview and organizational culture long before or independently of electoral politics. This creates a reservoir of committed personnel who can be mobilized for political, social, or relief work. Leadership transitions and electoral setbacks are buffered by a standing cadre that continues activity regardless of the immediate political weather. The DMK in Tamil Nadu developed a strong cadre tradition rooted in the Dravidian movement's cultural and social networks. Local structures, party wings, and a culture of continuous political discussion created dense organizational presence. Leadership has been highly personalized, Yet, the party has repeatedly returned to the need to review and activate its cadre base. The combination of a clear regional cultural ideology, long before experience of both power and opposition, and grassroots structures has allowed it to survive transitions more effectively than purely personality driven formations. What these durable systems share is not moral superiority, it is a set of practical mechanisms, a worldview that supplies meaning independent of the current leader, regular local non electoral organizational activity, pipelines for recruitment and socialization of successive generations. Embeddedness in social structures beyond pure politics, a combination of purpose and selective incentives, and some institutionalization of authority that reduces the need for constant personal arbitration by a supreme leader. Cadre is not created by declarations of internal democracy or by electoral success alone. It is created by sustained, local, purposeful organization that gives ordinary workers a reason to remain active when the cameras have moved on and the founding personalities have become either dominant or dispensable. Why do people accept personal cost, regular unpaid work, discipline, sometimes risk, without the usual hunger for personal glorification? Psychology and neuroscience offer partial answers that help explain the durability of these cadre systems. Identity fusion describes a state in which the boundary between the personal self and a group self becomes porous. The group's successes, threats, and honor are experienced as personally consequential. For fused individuals, group related information engages regions involved in self representation as if the group has been incorporated into the self concept. Acts of service are then experienced less as performances for external applause and more as expressions of the expanded self. Sacred values, commitments treated as non negotiable and resistant to ordinary trade offs, further limit the pure cost benefit calculation. When a value is sacralized, offering material reward in exchange for violating it can produce moral outrage rather than deliberation. The alternative to sacrifice is registered as a deeper form of loss. Costly and hard to fake behaviors function as signals of commitment. Regular attendance, willingness to perform low status work, and acceptance of discipline raise internal trust and make free riding more difficult. The neuroscience of cooperation shows that reward systems can be elicited by group level success even when the individual's immediate payoff is negative. Hormones and neuromodulators associated with bonding, oxytocin among them, further support in group affiliation, particularly in ritualized or synchronized settings. In other words, your brain and mind thrive as well in a group as they do individually. Meaning and purpose can be found in the group as much as it can be found in individual thought and activity. Many durable cadre organizations rely, therefore, on repeated structured practices, physical drills, collective discussion, symbolic markers, scheduled local gatherings. These produce interpersonal synchrony and shared attention. Synchrony is linked to increased cooperation, higher pain thresholds, and temporary reduction in self focused rumination. The subjective correlate is a quieting of ordinary self concern and a heightened sense of we. Finally, human beings appear to have a robust need for meaning and coherence. Cadre ideologies supply a narrative that situates the individual's life within a larger historical or moral arc. When effort and even suffering are rendered intelligible, tolerance for cost rises. In well functioning cadre systems, status is frequently tied to service, reliability, and ideological correctness rather than to personal media visibility. Public self promotion can be culturally penalized. Ego needs are not absent, they are redirected into group congruent channels. These mechanisms are powerful but not automatic. They require continuous maintenance through local practice. And when that practice lapses, the psychological infrastructure weakens. New movements that rely primarily on modern outrage, digital mobilization, and a central personality typically activate only a subset of these processes. We now, therefore, return to the central observation. The durability of the present ruling formation does not come from never yielding. It comes from the capacity to yield selectively, absorb the immediate cost, protect the core project, and reassert initiative on more favorable ground. Three interlocking elements support this capacity. Research on political psychology finds the same pattern across very different societies. When people feel collectively under threat, tolerance for centralized authority rises, sometimes sharply. A government that can manufacture or simply benefit from a sense of ongoing uncertainty is drawing on very old wiring. Not only the cadre's discipline, but the wider public search for someone who appears to be in control. First, the cadre infrastructure that precedes and outlasts electoral cycles, a continuous flow of socialized workers, electoral setbacks or tactical concessions do not empty that reservoir. The psychological mechanisms of fusion, sacred values, costly signaling, and ritual synchrony are institutionalized at scale. Personal sacrifice without self glorification is a normalized organizational expectation rather than an occasional heroic act. Second, a coherent and adaptable ideological frame. Cultural nationalism combined with a developmental and civilizational narrative supplies meaning larger than any single policy. When a particular measure or a particular minister becomes a high cost liability, the larger frame remains intact. Cadres and a significant section of voters can interpret a concession as temporary prudence rather than existential defeat. Repetition does real work here. What is heard often enough begins to feel familiar, and the brain quietly mistakes familiarity for truth. The well documented illusory truth effect. A frame repeated across cycles, ministers, and crises does not need to be re argued each time. It only needs to be recognizable. Third, an operational leadership style that separates the essential from the expendable. Mass connect and narrative dominance on one side, organizational control, electoral machinery, and cold calculation of timing and cost on the other. Together, they have shown the ability to distinguish between core commitments and positions that can be sacrificed when the political or street price becomes disproportionate. When power yields in this manner, it is not merely losing, it is choosing the ground on which it will next stand. Time is treated as a resource. Street energy is denied a prolonged focal point. The opposition's recurring difficulty in converting moral moments into organizational permanence is factored into the calculation. The core is protected, the periphery is negotiable. The bamboo bends in the storm, the rigid tree snaps. Durable political formations have often understood, whether by instinct or design, that the capacity to bend at the right moment is not the opposite of strength. It can be one of its conditions. Gandhi's long campaigns, King's patient building of a movement that could survive setbacks, Mandela's extraordinary capacity to think in decades than in new cycles, each in different ways illustrated that the long game requires both moral clarity and strategic patience. The present Indian case is not a moral parallel alone, it is an organizational one. The ability to yield without disintegration is a mark of structures that have depth beyond the immediate confrontation. We end where we began, not with celebration or lament, but with an observation. Political formations rise and recede. Some leave behind only the memory of a moment. Others leave behind structures that continue to shape the field long after particular leaders and particular concessions have been forgotten. The student movement of 2026, like the movements that preceded it, forced a visible yield. Whether it becomes more than an episode will depend less on the intensity of the original mobilization and more on the ability to build what most predecessors could not: commitment that does not require the continuous presence of the original faces, and purpose that survives the day the immediate demand is met. Cadre work is slow, it is local, repetitive, often unglamorous. It is the opposite of the viral moment. And it is what, more than any single leader's charisma or single protest's moral force, has so far decided which political projects endure. When power yields, the question is never only whether it is lost. The deeper question is whether it still possesses the capacity to continue. After the yield, will inspired brains become cultivated minds? There is a curious moment in every successful public movement that receives surprisingly little attention. It is the morning after. For weeks, perhaps months, everything has seemed wonderfully clear. An injustice that must be addressed, an institution that must respond, a demand around which people can gather. There are protagonists and antagonists, slogans and symbols, marches and fasts, arguments and counterarguments. The cameras arrive, social media amplifies. People who have never met one another discover that they share not merely an opinion but a cause. And then, sometimes unexpectedly, power yields. A minister resigns, a policy is withdrawn, a demand is accepted, negotiations begin, the protest is called off. There is celebration, understandably so, but something psychologically very interesting has happened at precisely the same moment. The movement has lost its adversary. Let me repeat that for you. At that moment of victory, the movement has lost its adversary. And the adversary, we sometimes forget, has been doing rather more than merely opposing the movement. It has been helping to define it. And this is where we resume our journey as the detached observer. In our first exploration of moral authority and collective minds, we asked how moral authority arises in public life. Why does the collective mind sometimes invest particular people with extraordinary credibility? Why does one individual come to embody a cause while another, perhaps equally committed, remains peripheral? We explored the importance of sequence, sacrifice, symbolism, and narrative ownership. Then, in When Power Yields, we moved across the barricade. We asked what happens inside durable systems of power when they encounter sustained moral pressure. We discovered that resilient power is not necessarily rigid power. It can concede on the periphery while protecting the core. It can bend, absorb, recalibrate, and continue. Our metaphor was the bamboo. The bamboo survives the storm not because it refuses to move, but because it knows how to yield without surrendering its roots. But we left one side of that metaphor unexplored. What about the movement itself? What happens to those who create the storm once the bamboo has bent? That question has become particularly interesting in contemporary India. A young, digitally fluent movement can emerge with remarkable speed, organize around a grievance, acquire enormous visibility, and demonstrate that sustained public pressure can produce a tangible consequence. In that moment, something powerful has unquestionably occurred. But victory and durability are not the same thing. Indeed, victory may expose a movement to a challenge considerably more difficult than opposition. During confrontation, Identity is relatively easy. We know what we are against. The institution across the barricade provides the answer. Once the barricade disappears, another question arrives. What are we for? The movement starts to question its own purpose. And that is a much harder question. Human beings are remarkably good at organizing around threat. A common adversary focuses attention, suppresses some internal differences, and gives otherwise disparate people a shared emotional vocabulary. We see this in families, in organizations, in nations, and political movements. Differences that seemed important yesterday suddenly become secondary when everyone is looking at the same direction. Remove the adversary, and the differences begin to return. The coalition must now generate coherence from within. The movement that was held together by opposition but it must discover whether it possesses something deeper than opposition. A worldview, perhaps, a set of values, a community, a practice, an institution, something capable of surviving the disappearance of the very problem that brought everyone together. And history suggests that this transition is extraordinarily difficult. The public square is filled with movements that once seemed unstoppable. Some transformed societies, some became political parties, some became institutions, some fragmented, some were absorbed into the very systems that they had challenged, and others, despite moments of extraordinary moral authority, simply receded from public consciousness. Let's ask why. Perhaps because we confuse two very different human capacities: inspiration and cultivation. The inspired brain is a remarkable thing. It can recognize injustice, imagine possibility, take courage from strangers, and suddenly believe that something previously accepted as inevitable can be changed. An inspired brain can inspire another brain and another until thousands, sometimes millions, become aligned around an idea. That is how movements begin. But inspiration is a moment. Cultivation, on the other hand, is a process. The cultivated mind is formed much more slowly through repetition, discipline, reflection, restraint, community, and the patient transformation of conviction into a habit. And so, in this third journey of the detached observer, our question changes once again. We are no longer asking how moral authority is acquired. We are no longer asking how power sometimes yields. We are asking what happens after the yield. Can the energy that creates a movement also sustain one? Can moral authority survive success? Can opposition become proposition? Can followers become custodians? Can a movement remain outside formal politics and still survive across generations? And the central question today is, can inspired brains become cultivated minds? And let's talk about various examples of that as we go along. Because the storm may reveal the strength of the bamboo, but the storm does not grow its roots. That happens quietly, slowly, over years, when nobody is watching. Every movement knows how to win a battle. Few know what to do after victory. There is something extraordinary about watching an idea become a movement. At first, there may be only one voice: a student refusing to attend school on a Friday, a young person questioning an examination system, a citizen standing in the public square, a solitary hunger strike. Nothing about those acts necessarily predicts what follows. Most such gestures disappear unnoticed, but occasionally something changes. Another person recognizes the grievance, then another. A photograph travels, a phrase acquires meaning, a hashtag gathers momentum. People who have never met begin speaking in a remarkably similar language. And somewhere along the way, an individual experience becomes a collective one. What has happened? We usually explain such movements through politics or sociology, but there is something deeply human, deeply biological that is taking place. The human brain is not an isolated thinking machine. It evolved in groups, depends upon groups, and remains extraordinarily sensitive to the emotions, intentions, and behavior of other human beings. We notice what others notice. We become anxious when those around us become anxious. We become angry more readily in the presence of collective anger. And courage, too, that can be contagious. Someone does publicly what we have privately imagined doing, and suddenly a possibility appears. Perhaps I can do this too. This is one of the remarkable transformations that movements create. They convert private discontent into shared recognition, and recognition changes behavior. A person who believes that they are alone with a grievance may remain silent. Discovering that thousands of others share it changes the calculation entirely. What seemed like an individual frustration becomes evidence of something larger. And the brain loves this kind of discovery. Novelty captures attention. Emotion increases salience. Reward systems respond to possibility. Social belonging reduces the psychological cost of action. The experience of acting together can itself become reinforcing. The protest ground, therefore, does something more interesting than simply assemble people. It aligns attention. Thousands of brains begin looking towards the same problem. The same images are watched, the same stories circulate, the same symbols acquire emotional significance, the same slogans are repeated. The boundaries between my grievance and our grievance begin to soften. A collective mind starts to emerge in those circumstances. Not literally, of course. There is no single brain sitting somewhere above the crowd directing everyone beneath it. But individual minds become temporarily synchronized around shared attention, shared emotion, and shared purpose. And in our digital age, this synchronization can happen with astonishing speed. For most of human history, movements required physical proximity. People had to gather in marketplaces, universities, factories, places of worship, or political meetings. Ideas traveled at the speed of conversation, pamphlet, newspaper, or radio. Today, a grievance can cross a country before breakfast. A 30-second video can provide the emotional stimulus. An algorithm can repeatedly place similar material before people already receptive to it. Memes can compress complicated political arguments into instantly recognizable symbols. A young person in one city can discover within minutes that thousands elsewhere are feeling precisely what she or he is feeling. The distance between private frustration and collective identity has perhaps never been shorter. Let's hold that thought. The distance between private frustration and collective identity has perhaps never been shorter, which helps explain the extraordinary velocity of some contemporary movements. But here lies the paradox. The very brain that responds so powerfully to novelty is also designed to become accustomed to it. Psychologists call this habituation. The extraordinary becomes familiar. The emotionally arresting image loses some of its force after repeated exposure. Yesterday's breaking news becomes today's background noise. The brain turns elsewhere. That is not indifference. It's one of the ways our nervous system preserves attention for what is new, changing, and potentially important. And so, movements encounter a biological problem as well as a political one. How do you sustain attention after novelty has disappeared? There is another difficulty. Opposition itself is remarkably efficient at organizing the mind. A clear adversary reduces complexity. There is us, there is them, there is something wrong, there is something that must change. Complex societies suddenly become cognitively manageable, and this is enormously useful during mobilization. People do not need to agree on everything. They only need to agree sufficiently on the one thing immediately before them. But success changes the cognitive task. Once the demand has been met, for example, once the minister resigns, the brain can no longer organize itself around the same threat. The question shifts from resistance to construction, and construction asks rather different things of us: patience, planning, compromise, memory, inhibition, tolerance of disagreement, the ability to hold several competing truths simultaneously, the capacity to continue working when there is no immediate reward and nobody is applauding. These are very different psychological demands from those required to join a protest. Movements sometimes appear most united immediately before victory and most fragmented immediately afterwards. The adversary had been supplying coherence to it. Its disappearance reveals how much internal coherence actually existed. There is also a subtler transformation. Success itself is rewarding. Recognition arrives, followers multiply, invitations appear, cameras turn towards previously unknown faces. A person who only weeks earlier was one among thousands may suddenly discover that thousands are waiting to hear what they think. That experience can be intoxicating, and it can arrive extraordinarily quickly. Public recognition can now be compressed into days, but psychological formation cannot. Perspective does not become deeper because one's follower count has increased. Restraint does not automatically accompany visibility. Wisdom does not arrive with virality. The capacity to carry authority develops much more slowly than authority itself can now be acquired. This mismatch may be one of the defining psychological problems of movements in the digital age. Fame can arrive before formation, and when it does, the individual and sometimes the movement itself must grow into an identity that the outside world has already bestowed upon it. Some manage the transition remarkably well. Others broaden until the original moral clarity becomes difficult to recognize. Still others discover that the coalition gathered around a single moment cannot survive the complexity that follows it. And history offers us some fascinating examples. Let's first talk about Greta Thunberg, a solitary schoolgirl outside the Swedish parliament who became one of the world's most recognizable climate activists. Then, a Pakistani schoolgirl whose extraordinary personal tragedy propelled her into global moral leadership. I'm talking about Malala Yousafzai, of course. And millions of people across the Arab world who discovered almost simultaneously that governments which had appeared immovable could suddenly fall. And here I'm talking about the Arab Spring. Greta Thunberg, Malala Yousafzai, the Arab Spring. Three very different stories, three very different trajectories, but each raises the same question. What happens when inspiration succeeds in capturing the imagination of the world, and the inspired brain must discover what comes next? The inspired brain begins movements. The cultivated mind sustains them. This is something that we need to absorb and understand. Fame can arrive before formation, and it's worth lingering on that thought because our age has made the distance between obscurity and extraordinary public recognition astonishingly short. For most of human history, authority accumulated slowly. Reputation traveled through communities and institutions. A teacher acquired disciplines. A scholar acquired readers. A political leader built a consistency. Recognition usually followed years of activity. The digital world has disrupted that sequence. Today, the world can confer symbolic importance upon someone before that person has had the time to understand what the symbolism means. Greta Thunberg offers perhaps one of the clearest examples of this. In August 2018, she was a 15-year-old sitting outside Swedish parliament with a handwritten sign calling for a school strike for climate action. There was something extraordinarily powerful about the image. A child, alone, a parliament behind her, and a proposition of almost disarming simplicity. If climate change threatens my future, why should I behave as if everything is normal? The symbolism traveled faster than any conventional organization could have traveled. Within months, the solitary protest had become Fridays for Future. Young people across continents were leaving classrooms and gathering in public spaces. Greta addressed international institutions and political leaders. She became one of the most recognizable faces of climate activism in the world. The inspired brain had found its symbol. But symbols carry a peculiar burden. Their power often comes from compression. One person becomes associated with one cause, one moral proposition, one unmistakable image. The simplicity gives the symbol its extraordinary force. As the person grows, however, life becomes more complicated. Other causes appear. New political positions are taken. Alliances broaden. The public figure develops views that extend beyond the original issue. This is entirely natural. Humans are not slogans. A 15-year-old cannot reasonably be expected to remain frozen forever in the moral frame through which the world first encountered her. Yet, the very process of becoming a fuller political person can dilute the symbolic simplicity that created the original authority. The symbol becomes a participant, and participation invites disagreement. Let me repeat that for you. The symbol becomes a participant, and participation invites disagreement. That does not mean that Greta Thunberg has ceased to matter. Far from it. But her trajectory illustrates something important about moral authority. The wider the portfolio of causes, the harder it becomes to preserve the clarity of the original symbol. Now consider another woman whose journey into global consciousness was even more dramatic. Malala Yousafzai. Her story began not with social media virality, but with something horrifyingly real. A young girl insisting upon the right to education in an environment where doing so placed her life at risk. When she was shot by a Taliban gunman in 2012, Malala became more than an individual victim of violence. She became a global symbol of something almost universally comprehensible: the right of a girl to go to school. Recognition followed rapidly: international attention, speeches, awards, eventually the Nobel Peace Prize. Here too was extraordinary elevation occurring at extraordinary speed. But what followed was interestingly different. Rather than allow her public identity to expand indefinitely across every available cause, much of Malala's work remained anchored to the proposition from which her moral authority had originally arisen. Girls should have access to education. And crucially, the cause acquired an institution, the Malala Fund. That transition matters. A person can inspire, an institution can continue. An institution can employ people, support programs, develop expertise, distribute resources, build partnerships, and continue working on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon when there are no television cameras nearby. Malala's trajectory, therefore, offers us another possibility. Perhaps moral authority need not remain at its original emotional intensity in order to endure. Indeed, perhaps maturity sometimes requires accepting that it will not. The symbol becomes quieter, the work becomes deeper, intensity begins to become continuity. And then there is the Arab Spring. Its spark came from an individual whose name would become known across the world only after he could no longer witness what he had begun. Mohamed Bouazizi was a young Tunisian street vendor struggling to make a living. In December 2010, following a confrontation with local officials, he set himself on fire. An intensely personal act of despair became something far larger. Bouazizi could not design the movement that followed. He could not determine its ideology, choose its leaders, or control the meanings subsequently attached to his death. Yet, millions recognized something in his story: humiliation, economic frustration, powerlessness, the indignity of encountering an authority against which the ordinary individual seemed to possess no recourse. Tunisia erupted, and then something remarkable happened. Possibility became contagious. Egypt watched Tunisia. Others watched Egypt. People who had lived for decades under political systems that seemed immovable suddenly discovered that permanence itself might have been an illusion. Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Syria, Bahrain, different societies, different political histories, and ultimately profoundly different outcomes. It would be simplistic to speak of the Arab Spring as though it were one movement with one fate. But as a phenomenon of collective psychology, it remains extraordinary. For a brief historical moment, millions of inspired brains appear to arrive at the same astonishing conclusion: power can move. And the Arab Spring produced its own unexpected faces. One of the most fascinating was Vail Ghonim, a young Google executive who had anonymously helped administer the Facebook page "We Are All Khaled Said," created after the death of a young Egyptian man following police brutality. The page helped create something that digital movements do remarkably well. It allowed people privately experiencing anger to discover that their anger was shared. Ghonim was detained by the Egyptian authorities during the uprising. When he emerged and appeared in an emotional television interview, he rapidly became one of the recognizable faces of the revolution. Again, fame before formation. A relatively unknown technology executive had become, within days, a symbol of a historic political moment. One might have imagined the trajectory from there. Activist becomes leader, leader becomes politician, politician enters government. But that is not what happened. Ghanim's subsequent journey became much more interesting. He gradually stepped away from the political center of the revolution and with time became increasingly reflective about the very technology that had helped make the uprising possible. Social media had demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to mobilize, But mobilization was not deliberation. It was remarkably good at allowing people to gather around anger, expose injustice, and declare what they opposed. It was considerably less successful at helping those same people listen to one another, tolerate disagreement, negotiate complexity, and construct an alternative. The network knew how to create the square. It did not know how to create the institution. And let me repeat that for you to sit with. The network knew how to create the square. It did not know how to create the institution. Because removing an adversary and constructing an alternative require different forms of collective intelligence. Liberals, religious groups, students, workers, professionals, nationalists, and ordinary citizens may stand beside one another because they agree that the existing order must change. Once it does, all the questions temporarily suspended by the opposition return. Who governs? By what rules? Which institutions are trusted? How is authority transferred? How are minorities protected? What happens when yesterday's allies profoundly disagree? The crowd that knows how to occupy a square does not automatically contain within itself the architecture of a state. And so the trajectories diverged. Some countries experienced political openings followed by reversal. Others descended into instability or civil war. Old structures of power reasserted themselves in new forms. Tunisia, for years regarded as the most hopeful democratic outcome of the Arab Spring, subsequently experienced its own democratic erosion. None of this means that the protests were futile. That would be historically simplistic and morally lazy. The question is something more demanding. The capacity to dismantle an existing order is not the same as the capacity to cultivate what follows it. Greta Thunberg, Malala Yousafzai, Wael Ghonim, and the millions who participated in the Arab Spring offer us very different windows into the journey after inspiration. Greta shows us what can happen when symbolic identity broadens beyond the extraordinary clarity of its originating cause, in her case, the environment. Malala offers another possibility. The moral moment narrows into a mission, and the mission acquires institutional form. Ghonim gives us perhaps the most introspective trajectory of all, the activist who helped demonstrate the extraordinary power of digital mobilization and then began questioning whether mobilization itself was enough. Diffusion, institutionalization, reflection, three trajectories, and behind them, the Arab Spring gives us the larger and more sobering possibility, fragmentation. Not verdicts, trajectories, because the inspired brain can move extraordinarily quickly. The cultivated mind cannot. It requires time, repetition, structure, disagreement, reflection, and the gradual discovery of what one will continue doing after the emotional intensity of the original moment has passed. And this brings us back to India, because not very long ago, India conducted its own remarkable experiment in precisely this transition. A movement gathered enormous moral authority around a grievance that almost everyone could understand. It briefly captured the imagination of the country. And then came the question that awaits every moment after inspiration. What next? One part gradually disappeared from public consciousness. Another chose politics. And the divergent trajectories of those two offspring tell us something profound about the possibilities and the price of survival. India against corruption and the Aam Aadmi Party. Let's remember, fame can arrive before formation. If Greta, Malala, and the Arab Spring invite us to think globally, modern India offers perhaps the most instructive experiment of all, because here we are able to observe something rather unusual, not simply a movement, But what happened after the movement divided? In 2011, India Against Corruption became one of the most remarkable civic mobilizations in independent India. Its moral proposition was almost impossible to misunderstand. Corruption was no longer merely an administrative inconvenience or an unavoidable feature in public life. It had become an ethical question, a question of trust, of citizenship, of whether ordinary people could still believe that public institutions ultimately existed to serve them. The movement possessed something that all successful movements possess: clarity. There was a grievance, there was a demand, there were recognizable moral figures, there was a nation watching. And for a brief period, it seemed entirely possible that something fundamental in Indian public life had shifted. If you lived through that moment, you will remember thousands of ordinary people gathering, lighting candles, running protest marches. India Against Corruption was really a very significant public movement when it happened. Yet, history rarely ends at the point where television coverage concludes. What followed was considerably more interesting than the mobilization itself. The movement, in effect, conducted an experiment. One path sought to preserve the movement, the other sought to transform it. India Against Corruption gradually receded from public life. The emotional intensity that had sustained it inevitably became more difficult to maintain. The immediate objective had changed. The urgency softened. Public attention migrated elsewhere, as it invariably does. Today, India Against Corruption survives more as a historical memory than as a living civic force. But another part of the movement reached a different conclusion. If institutions could not be persuaded from outside, perhaps they had to be entered from within. That decision led to the birth of the Aam Aadmi Party. In retrospect, it was an extraordinary moment. The protester decided to become the ruler. Few transitions in public life are more psychologically demanding than this. Opposition and governance are often imagined to be neighboring activities. They are not. Opposition asks whether something is right. Government must also ask if something is possible. Opposition thrives on moral clarity. Government lives with ambiguity. Opposition can simplify. Government must continuously reconcile competing interests, imperfect information, finite resources, and difficult compromises. The very qualities that make someone an effective protest leader do not necessarily make them an effective administrator, nor should we expect them to. These are different cognitive worlds. Yet, Aam Aadmi Party demonstrated something equally important. Movements can survive. They need not disappear simply because the protest has ended. They can acquire organization, leadership, cadres, election machinery, governance, institutional memory, and continuity. From the perspective of organizational evolution, this was a remarkable achievement. But it came with a price. Perhaps the price was inevitable. The moral simplicity available to an outsider rarely survives intact once one becomes responsible for governing. Every difficult administrative decision produces critics. Every compromise appears to someone as a betrayal. Every institution eventually develops hierarchies, procedures, and internal tensions. The movement that once stood outside the system gradually discovers that it itself has become part of the system. That is not necessarily hypocrisy. It may simply be the unavoidable psychology of power. History has repeatedly shown us that governing is not merely protesting in another language. It's an entirely different mental discipline, which brings us to an intriguing paradox. India Against Corruption preserved much of its moral memory, but it gradually lost its organizational continuity. The Aam Aadmi Party achieved organizational continuity, but inevitably surrendered some of the moral simplicity that had made the original movement so compelling. Neither trajectory should surprise us. One preserved inspiration, the other cultivated institution. One became history, the other became government. And perhaps that leaves us with a more profound question that either movement originally intended to ask. Is this the only choice available? Must every successful civic movement eventually accept one of two destinies: to remain morally pure but gradually fade into irrelevance, or to acquire influence by entering politics and in doing so accept the compromises that influence invariably demands? At first glance, history appears to suggest that these are indeed the only possibility. But is that really so? Or is there another organizational structure altogether, one that neither disappears nor contests elections, one that remains formally outside political office and yet survives, influences societies, and transmits its values across generations? If such an organization exists, it would deserve our attention, not because we necessarily agree with its worldview, but because it may have solved the very problem that has occupied this entire journey. How does inspiration become continuity? And to answer that question, we must now turn to an organization that has existed for over a century without itself becoming a political party: the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, or the RSS. One of the most remarkable examples in modern India is the RSS. Whether one admires it, disagrees with it, or remains entirely indifferent to its worldview is beside the point for the question that interests us today. The Detached Observer is asking something different. How has an organization remained relevant for over a century without itself becoming an electoral political party? Political parties rise and fall. Governments can come and go. Leaders emerge and disappear. Generations change. Yet the organization itself persists, and that deserves curiosity. The first answer appears deceptively simple. The RSS is not organized around a grievance, it is organized around a worldview. That distinction matters enormously. A grievance creates urgency, a worldview creates continuity. Grievances eventually change. Worldviews aspire to explain the world itself. A movement organized around a grievance asks what is wrong. An organization organized around a worldview asks how should we live. There is another distinction. Most protest movements gather an audience. The RSS cultivates a community. Audiences assemble when something interesting happens. Communities continue meeting when nothing appears to be happening at all. This is where organizational psychology begins to intersect with neuroscience. Identity is not built only through ideas. It is built through repetition, through routine, through shared experience, through ordinary encounters repeated over the years. The most revealing question may therefore be the simplest. Imagine an ordinary Tuesday morning. There is no election, no national crisis, no protest, no television cameras. What does a member actually do? That question is surprisingly important because organizations that survive generations usually possess a compelling answer. The RSS calls it the Shaka. The details matter less than the principle. People gather, they meet regularly, they exercise, they converse, they learn, they teach. Relationships deepen, stories are retold, leadership quietly passes from one generation to the next. The extraordinary is sustained through the ordinary. This is a very different model from mobilization. Mobilization depends upon moments. Cultivation depends upon rhythm. And rhythm changes the brain. Every repeated practice strengthens familiarity. Every familiar activity becomes easier to repeat. Over time, effort gradually gives way to habit. Habit begins to shape identity. Identity begins to shape culture. Eventually, the organization no longer depends primarily upon charismatic individuals because its practices themselves have become carriers of its continuity. Perhaps this explains why so many movements struggle after their founders leave. Followers are not the same as custodians. Followers gather around personalities. Custodians inherit practices. There is a crucial distinction. History remembers charismatic leaders because they are visible. Institutions survive because thousands of comparatively anonymous people continue doing ordinary things extraordinarily consistently. Perhaps this is the quiet genius of every enduring institution: the monastery, the university, the regiment, the family, the research laboratory, the orchestra. None survives because inspiration is continuously renewed. They survive because inspiration eventually becomes practice. Let me repeat that. None survives because inspiration is continuously renewed. They survive because inspiration eventually becomes practice. At this point, one begins to understand why history has been kinder to cultivation than to excitement. Inspiration can ignite extraordinary moments. Cultivation quietly shapes extraordinary centuries, which leaves us with an intriguing possibility. Perhaps the question facing every new civic movement is not whether it should become a political party or whether it should remain a protest. Perhaps the deeper question is whether it can discover a way of life capable of existing between moments of confrontation. Can it create practices rather than merely campaigns? Can it cultivate custodians rather than simply followers? Can it answer the ordinary Tuesday morning? Because if it cannot, history suggests that inspiration, however magnificent, may prove remarkably difficult to sustain. There is, however, one tradition that understood this long before modern political movements existed. It belonged neither to governments nor to protesters. It belonged to warriors, and it began not on the battlefield but in the dojo. Followers gather around personalities. Custodians inherit practices. Let's remember that while we go to this next section. If there's one image that has quietly accompanied this journey from the very beginning, it is that of the samurai. Not the samurai of cinema, not the warrior charging across a battlefield with a drawn sword, but the samurai returning day after day to the dojo. Popular imagination remembers the battle. The samurai understood that the battle was only the examination. The real work happened long before the sword was ever drawn. Discipline, repetition, attention, restraint, balance, respect, the patient refinement of both body and mind. Hours becoming days, days becoming years, years becoming character. When conflict finally arrived, the battle did not create the samurai. It merely revealed what had already been cultivated. Perhaps this is true not only of individuals but of movements. We have spent this journey examining moments of extraordinary inspiration. Greta Thunberg sitting alone outside the Swedish parliament, Malala Yousafzai refusing to surrender her education, Vail Ghanem helping to awaken a generation through digital networks, the crowds of the Arab Spring discovering that fear itself could break, India against corruption filling Ramlila Maidan, the birth of the Aam Aadmi Party, the remarkable organizational continuity of the RSS. Each story appears different, but beneath them lies the same question: Where was the dojo? What existed before the battle? And perhaps more importantly, what continued after the battle ended? The dojo is a curious place. Nothing spectacular appears to happen there. No crowds gather, no cameras arrive, no applause follows. The same movements are repeated, the same principles revisited, the same mistakes corrected, the same discipline quietly renewed. And it is this, in many ways, the opposite of what we do in social media. The battlefield attracts attention, the dojo creates capability. And yet, civilization has always depended far more upon dojos than upon battlefields. The battlefield reveals character, the dojo cultivates it. Perhaps this is the distinction we've been searching for throughout this entire exploration. The inspired brain belongs naturally to the battlefield. It recognizes injustice, it responds to urgency, it gathers courage from others, it acts, it mobilizes, it changes history. Without inspired brains, societies stagnate. But inspired brains alone cannot sustain history. That requires something slower. The cultivated mind belongs to the dojo. It asks different questions. How do we remain truthful after success? How do we prevent power from changing us? How do we transmit our values to people who are not present at the founding moment? How do followers become custodians? How do institutions survive the departure of their founders? These are not questions answered by inspiration. They are answered by cultivation. The more one reflects upon enduring institutions, the more one notices the same pattern. Monasteries possess their daily offices. Universities have their seminars and tutorials. Scientific communities cultivate peer review, mentorship, and apprenticeship. Classical musicians practice scales that audiences never hear. Families transmit values through rituals so ordinary that children scarcely notice that they are learning. The extraordinary survives because the ordinary is repeated. Perhaps movements are no different. Every movement knows how to create a battlefield. Far fewer know how to create a dojo. A battlefield answers the question, what are we prepared to fight? A dojo answers a more demanding one, what are we prepared to become? There is another image that has remained with me since our previous episode, the bamboo. We spoke then about how durable power survives by bending. But there is another lesson hidden within the same plant. Storms do not grow roots, storms reveal them. Roots are created quietly, underground, through seasons that attract no attention whatsoever. Movements often mistake the storm for their source of strength. It is not. The storm merely exposes the strength or the absence of what has been already cultivated beneath the surface. Perhaps this is why history repeatedly surprises us. Movements that appear unstoppable sometimes disappear with astonishing speed. Others, almost unnoticed by the wider world, quietly reshape societies over generations. The difference is rarely the brilliance of the flower. It is usually the depth of the root. And so we arrive at the proposition that has gradually emerged over these episodes. The inspired brain asks, what must change? The cultivated mind asks, what must we become? One begins movements, the other sustains civilization. And that brings us finally back to the question that prompted this entire journey. A young movement has demonstrated that it can inspire. It has shown us that it can mobilize. It has persuaded power to yield. I'm talking about the Cockroach Janata Party and what happened in Jantar Mantar. History applauds such moments, but history also asks another question. Where is the dojo? Because long after the crowds have dispersed, long after the slogans have faded, and long after the adversary has changed, The future of every movement will depend not upon the brilliance of its battlefield, but upon the quiet discipline of its dojo. Every movement knows how to build a battlefield. Few know how to build a dojo. And so we return to where this journey began. It has reminded an entire generation that institutions are neither as distant or as immovable as they sometimes appear. It has inspired participation among people who may have previously believed that public life belonged only to politicians and governments. That in itself is no small achievement. History should acknowledge it. But history also asks difficult questions of every movement that succeeds, not because success deserves suspicion, but because success changes the movement itself. The questions we have asked today are therefore not directed towards one organization alone. They are directed towards every movement that survives long enough to encounter its own success. Can inspiration become cultivation? Can mobilization become community? Can digital networks become enduring human relationships? Can followers become custodians? Can a shared grievance mature into a shared philosophy? Can transparency demanded of others become transparency practiced by oneself? Can moral authority renew itself after the original moral moment has passed? These are not questions that can be answered in weeks or months. History measures them in years, sometimes in generations. And perhaps this is why prediction itself is such a hazardous occupation. History is filled with confident forecasts that prove entirely mistaken. Movements dismissed at passing moments sometimes reshape nations. Others, seemingly irresistible at their height, quietly disappear into footnotes. The detached observer should therefore resist prophecy. Curiosity is a better companion than certainty. Yet, curiosity does not require us to suspend judgment altogether. History leaves clues. It suggests that inspiration, however magnificent, is rarely enough, that every enduring institution eventually discovers the necessity of cultivation, that communities outlast crowds, that practice outlasts passion, that rituals outlast slogans. Continuity is rarely built in moments of excitement. It's built in the long intervals between them. Let me repeat that for you to think about. Continuity is rarely built in moments of excitement. It is built in the long intervals between them. Which brings us back to the deceptively simple question we encountered earlier. What happens on an ordinary Tuesday morning when there is no protest, no controversy, no cameras, no urgent call to assemble? What do people continue doing together? Because it is there in those ordinary days rather than the extraordinary ones that the future of every movement is quietly decided. And perhaps that is the true meaning of the journey we have taken together. The inspired brain awakens us. It helps us recognize injustice. It persuades us that change is possible. But the cultivated mind asks something altogether more demanding. Not simply how shall we change the world, but what kind of people must we become if that change is to endure? The answer to that question will not be found in the excitement of the next protest, nor in the celebration that follows the next victory. It will be found quietly and almost invisibly in the years that follow. For that is where every movement eventually discovers whether it has merely inspired a generation or begun cultivating one. Perhaps every generation believes that it's witnessing unprecedented change. Perhaps every generation imagines that its movements, its technologies, and its public debates are unlike anything that has gone before. And yet, history has a curious way of reminding us that while the actors change, the deeper questions remain remarkably constant. How do human beings gather around shared purpose? How do they persuade power to listen? How do they preserve what is worth preserving while changing what must change? How does a moment become a civilization? Looking back over this journey, one begins to notice that the stories we have explored were never really about Greta Thunberg, Malala Yousafzai, Whale Ghanem, the Arab Spring, India against corruption, the Aam Aadmi Party, or even the RSS. They were windows. Each allowed us to glimpse a different stage in the life of an idea. Its birth, its inspiration, its confrontation with power, its victory, its fragmentation, its institutionalization, its cultivation. Some ideas remained moments, others became movements, very few became traditions. And that might be the quiet aspiration of every civilization, not simply to produce inspired people, but to cultivate inspiring cultures. For cultures remember what individuals cannot. They carry memory across generations. They preserve practices after the founders have gone. They transform personal conviction into shared inheritance. This, perhaps, is why the future has never belonged exclusively to the brilliant, the charismatic, or the disruptive. History certainly remembers them, but history is sustained by another kind of person altogether: the teacher who returns to the classroom every Monday morning, the parent whose values quietly shape a child, the volunteer who continues serving after public attention has moved elsewhere, the researcher who spends decades pursuing a single question, the monk who rises before dawn to meditate, the physician who listens carefully to one more patient, the citizen who continues believing that public life deserves care even when nobody is watching. Civilizations are rarely built by moments of inspiration alone. They are built by millions of acts of cultivation. Perhaps that is the lesson the samurai understood. The sword was never the point. The point was the person who carried it. Perhaps it is the lesson enduring institutions have always understood. The protest was never the destination, it was only the beginning. And perhaps this is the lesson each one of us must eventually discover in our lives. There are moments when we are called to speak, moments when we are called to resist, moments when we are called to challenge. All those moments matter. Societies need inspired brains. Without them, complacency becomes culture. But once the moment has passed, another calling quietly presents itself: to cultivate, to deepen, to mentor, to build, to transmit, to leave behind institutions stronger than ourselves, to become less interested in being remembered than in ensuring what truly matters continuous. And perhaps that is the deepest meaning of leadership. Perhaps it's also the deepest meaning of citizenship. Not did you inspire people, but what did you cultivate after they were inspired? Because the yield is never the end of the story, it is only the beginning of another. The inspired brain awakens possibility. The cultivated mind makes possibility endure. Thank you for joining me on another journey through the Detached Observer. Until next time, keep wondering not only about the world around you, but about the quieter journeys taking place within yourselves. For it is there, perhaps, that every enduring movement truly begins. This time at the end of our journey rather than the beginning. 3 episodes ago, I began with what appeared to be a straightforward question: how does a moment become a movement? Looking back, I realized that the question was never quite that simple. Writing these 3 episodes taught me something I had not anticipated. Each episode appeared to ask a different question. In reality, they were examining the same phenomenon from 3 different vantage points. Of moral authority and collective minds suggested that legitimacy is rarely determined by the strength of an argument alone. It is shaped by sequence. Who was seen to move first? Who followed? Who came to embody the moral imagination of the moment? Trust, it seemed, had its own psychology. When power yields turned to the far side of the barricade, there too I found a familiar pattern. Durable power rarely survives through rigidity alone. It survives by choosing, with considerable care, where to bend and where not to. by conceding the periphery while protecting what it considers its center. The bamboo once again. And after the yield revealed that movements face a test every bit as demanding as the one they present to power. Not whether they can inspire, we already know they can, but whether the inspiration that gathered a crowd can gradually become something quieter and more enduring. Practice, institution, community, a dojo rather than merely a battlefield. Looking back across all three episodes, I find myself seeing the same architecture repeated. Different actors, different events, different outcomes, yet beneath them the same human machinery, millions of predicting brains attempting to reduce uncertainty. Who do I trust? Who should I follow? Has power really changed? What should I do next? And when the noise finally subsides, what, if anything, will still remain? None of these conversations settles who was right in the public confrontations we have discussed. That was never their purpose. The purpose was to notice the architecture beneath the argument, the sequence, the storm, the cultivation that follows. Long after the names, the controversies, and the headlines have faded, that architecture will remain quietly at work. Public life will continue producing moments. Some will capture the imagination of a generation, others will disappear almost immediately. A few will become movements, and a very small number may eventually become institutions worthy of enduring. Whether that happens will depend upon the same quiet questions we have explored together. Who first earned trust? How did power respond? What was protected? And perhaps most importantly, what was cultivated once nobody was watching? Perhaps that is the larger question these conversations have offered. Societies will always need inspired brains. Without them, complacency becomes culture and injustice goes unchallenged. But inspiration, magnificent though it is, has never been enough. Civilizations endure because inspired brains gradually become cultivated minds. Moments awaken societies, movements reshape them, but only cultivated minds build civilization. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Detached Observer. Until our next conversation, take care of your brain, your body, and your mind. If you like what we do here, subscribe and share. We are on Apple, YouTube, and Spotify. Thank you so much.